Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning crept into the town of Kadara with the same reluctance that had clung to its corners for years. A sleepy fog hovered just above the crooked rooftops, blurring the boundary between sky and ground. Dew gathered like secrets on old windows, and the air carried that dense silence only small towns know, the kind that hangs like thick curtains between neighbors and old friends alike. Thomas Barker sat alone on the weathered bench outside the Kadara Civil Registry, the building's faded paint peeling like scabs on wounded skin. His hands, veined and tanned, clutched a crisp envelope, the divorce papers he had rehearsed in his head 100 different ways, but had yet to speak aloud. His eyes, sunken from sleepless nights, stared ahead not at the road, but into the vast nothingness he had come to know far too well. He wore a gray linen shirt, slightly wrinkled at the collar, the same one he'd worn to their wedding rehearsal 12 years ago. Whether he remembered that or not, even he wasn't sure. Some things the heart forgets on purpose, as a way to keep standing. He shifted slightly, the bench groaning beneath him, and glanced at the time, 8:47. They were supposed to meet at 9. She had always been late. Late to dinners. Late to birthdays. Late to apologies. The old rusted sign above the registry office swayed with the wind, groaning like an old man reluctant to stand. Somewhere down the street, a kettle whistled in one of the open kitchen windows, its sharp cry slicing through the quiet like a knife through old cloth. There was something about the way mornings unfolded in Kadara that made time feel slow and sticky, like honey clinging to the edge of a spoon. Thomas had never hated the town. He hadn't loved it either. It was just where life had kept him, stuck in the molasses of routine, watching the days stretch out like empty roads. He traced a faint scratch on the wooden bench with his thumb, the sharp edge digging gently into his skin, a kind of pain that reminded him he was still here. Behind him, a rusted bicycle leaned against the outer wall of the registry office, its tire sagging, its chain loose like promises made too soon. A few town officials trickled in and out, barely sparing him a glance. Maybe they already knew. News in Kadara traveled faster than birds, twisted, spun, and served up with morning tea. He had no doubt the women in the tailor shop 2 blocks away were already whispering about his pending divorce. Maybe they had even taken bets on who would arrive first. That's how small-town silence worked. It watched you, judged you, carried your name in its mouth like a secret it couldn't quite keep. He let out a breath and watched it vanish in the morning chill. In all the months leading up to this moment, Thomas had imagined what it would feel like. Relief, closure, maybe even freedom. But now that he was here, all he felt was hollow, as if someone had scooped out his insides and filled him with fog. The air shifted just before he heard the hum of the car. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, the kind of engine purr that made people turn their heads without knowing why. Thomas looked up slowly, his gaze locking on the black Mercedes as it turned the corner, like it had every right to own the road. It didn't belong in Kadara. Too polished. Too precise. It glided rather than drove, like a shadow cutting through light. The car eased to a stop in front of the registry, not a single jolt or hiccup in its movement. From the driver's seat stepped out a man dressed in a navy blue uniform, his shoulders squared, face unreadable behind sleek sunglasses. He walked around the car with the silent poise of someone trained to be invisible, then opened the back door with a gentle bow of his head. And there she was. Amara stepped out as though the world had been waiting for her to arrive. She didn't look around. She didn't fumble. Her heels touched the ground with the soft finality of punctuation, like the period at the end of a long-forgotten sentence. Her hair was swept into a low bun, not a strand out of place. A beige shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and a gold bracelet clinked softly with each movement. She didn't smile, but she wasn't cold either. Her presence was simply controlled, like a fire placed behind glass. Thomas's fingers clenched around the envelope in his hand, knuckles paling. He had imagined this moment 1,000 ways, her crying, yelling, maybe begging. But this unreadable calm? It startled him more than anger ever could. Amara walked up to him slowly, each step measured like a queen returning from war, victorious but exhausted. She stopped just close enough that he could smell the faint trace of her perfume, something floral, light, and maddeningly familiar. Her eyes, dark and steady, searched his face for something he wasn't even sure he had left. Thomas rose from the bench, the envelope hanging limply at his side like a forgotten suitcase. They stood there, suspended in time, two people who had once shared a life now struggling to share even a breath. And then, without ceremony or explanation, Amara leaned in, her lips barely moving, and whispered in his ear, "You're not divorcing me, Thomas. Not today. Not after what I came to tell you." Her words were smooth, unshaken, but there was a tremble buried deep beneath the surface, like glass under pressure, moments from cracking. Thomas stepped back slightly, his brow furrowed, caught between disbelief and something stranger, hope maybe. But she didn't wait for a reply. Without another word, Amara turned on her heels and walked past him, her driver falling into step behind her like a silent shadow. The large double doors of the registry creaked open as she entered, and Thomas remained outside, his world tilting slightly off-center. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief, heart-wrenching moment, he forgot why he had come. The envelope slipped from his hand and fluttered against the bench like a dying bird. Something had just begun. Something he hadn't prepared for. And though he couldn't name it yet, deep down he knew. This was no ordinary ending. Thomas stood still for a long time, watching the large registry doors swing shut behind her, the echo of their creak still ringing faintly in his ears. The envelope he had dropped fluttered beside his foot, one corner pinned under his shoe, as if begging for a second thought. But Thomas didn't move to pick it up. His mind was swirling in directions he hadn't anticipated. The certainty he carried with him just moments ago, cold, hard certainty, had thinned into something soft and uncertain, like morning fog creeping into an empty house. What did she mean he wasn't divorcing her? What truth could possibly shift a year of silence, of emotional decay, of a relationship worn down to the marrow? He closed his eyes for a second, long enough to remember her voice, calm but edged, soft but carrying weight. It wasn't a desperate voice. It wasn't pleading. It was steady, and that steadiness made his chest tighten. There's something about a person speaking with confidence while standing on the edge of ruin that unnerves the soul. He stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the damp earth like he was testing it for weakness, then reached down, picked up the envelope, and tucked it back into the inner pocket of his jacket. His hand lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, like he was holding on to the last piece of the man who had come to end things. Then, with a breath that tasted like iron, he walked toward the registry, unsure whether he was stepping into a conversation or into a storm. The air inside the building was cooler, still scented faintly with old wood and ink and something sterile that clung to government buildings no matter where you went. The floor tiles, worn down in the middle from decades of passing feet, made soft squeaks beneath his steps. To his left, a glass window separated the front desk from the public space, and behind it sat a thin woman with round glasses perched on her nose, a mug of tea nestled between her hands like a bird warming an egg. She looked up briefly, offered a nod that suggested she already knew who he was, then returned to her computer without a word. Thomas kept walking, his eyes scanning the empty corridor ahead, the soft clicking of Amara's heels now echoing faintly through the walls. The registry office wasn't large, but its narrow halls made it feel like a labyrinth, and today it might as well have been one. Around the bend, past a faded sign marked Private Room C, he found her. She was standing by the window of the waiting lounge at the far end of the hall, her shawl now folded over one arm, her body angled slightly toward the view of the courtyard below. A fountain trickled in the center of it, the water catching sunlight like scattered coins. She didn't turn when she heard him approach, but she spoke, quietly, as if afraid the walls might overhear. "I know what you think this is," she said. "But it isn't that. I didn't come to stop the divorce because I still love you." Her words cut through the stillness with surgical precision. Thomas stopped a few feet behind her, uncertain whether to feel relieved or insulted. She turned finally, her eyes tired, but alive with something else. "I came because you deserve the truth about what happened, and because I owe you an explanation. One I should have given a long time ago." He didn't sit. His legs were steady, but something inside him felt hollowed out. The hallway had dimmed slightly, or maybe it was his mind playing tricks, casting shadows over places light once lived. He looked at her carefully now, searching for the woman he had married, the woman who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen with flour on her cheeks and music in her bones. That woman was gone, or buried beneath layers of someone far more composed, almost guarded. "You owe me nothing," he said quietly, but there was no heat in his voice. He meant it at face value, and yet he didn't. She raised an eyebrow gently. "That's where you're wrong." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, faded envelope, worn at the edges like it had been handled more times than a prayer. "This," she said, placing it gently on the side table, "is where it begins. Or perhaps, where everything began to end." He stared at it, not touching it, not moving. There was something ominous about the envelope, something final. He had held plenty of papers over the years, school records, wedding vows, death certificates. But this one made his fingers ache just looking at it. Amara folded her arms, watching him. "Do you remember Grace?" she asked, her voice quieter than a whisper now, almost lost in the hum of the nearby vending machine. And just like that, the name wrapped around his spine like cold wire. Grace. The name hit him in a place he hadn't touched in years. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He blinked, and when his voice returned, it barely made it past his throat. "She's dead," he said flatly. "She ran away. You told me she ran." The silence that followed was the kind that made clocks sound louder than hearts. Amara sat down gently in the chair near the corner, one hand resting on the table beside the envelope as if guarding it from vanishing. "She didn't run away," she said. "She vanished, yes, but not because she wanted to. And she isn't dead. She's alive, Thomas. She's been alive all these years." His knees buckled slightly, and he took a step back, steadying himself against the wall. The words didn't land all at once. They hovered first, suspended in the air like smoke, then sank into his chest like stones in a pond. "Alive? Grace? The girl who had vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions behind?" "Why would you?" he began, but she held up her hand, not rudely but urgently. "I don't expect you to believe me yet. But I need you to listen. Because what happened, it wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. And I'm not innocent in it. None of us were." Her voice broke just slightly then, like a violin string pulled too tight. Thomas looked at her, really looked. For the first time in years, she looked human. Not the polished woman who had stepped out of a luxury car, but someone carrying the weight of something too heavy for one heart alone. "She was in love with you," Amara continued, her voice like gravel now. "And you were in love with her. But I changed everything." The walls of the hallway seemed to inch closer, the air thickening as the past dragged its feet into the present. Thomas stepped forward slowly, hands shaking, his breath a slow stagger. "Tell me everything," he said. And with a single nod, Amara began to unbury the truth. The rain began just as Amara opened the envelope, light at first, like the sky was unsure of its own sadness. She didn't seem surprised by it. If anything, she welcomed the soft patter against the registry windows as though the weather, too, had agreed to mourn. Thomas sat beside her now, posture taut, his eyes glued to her every movement, half dreading the words that would follow but unable to stop himself from leaning in. The envelope was thin, but what it carried had weight. She slipped out its contents with a kind of reverence, her fingers steady but cautious, as if she feared they might catch fire. What emerged was a letter, aged, creased, ink fading at the corners. Her voice did not tremble when she began to read. The words belonged to Grace, but Amara delivered them like someone at a confession booth, every line peeling a layer off the facade she had worn for over a decade. Thomas could hear the younger Grace in each sentence, her tone clever but wounded, her heart stitched together with fear and hope in equal measure. He remembered her handwriting instantly, looping, uncertain, always pressing a little too hard when she felt something deeply. "Thomas, if you're reading this, something went wrong," it began. "Not wrong like a spilled drink or missed call, wrong in the kind of way that changes everything, wrong like someone taking a pair of scissors to a life you were still sewing together." Thomas sat frozen, as though the words themselves were anchoring him to the floor, refusing to let him move until the whole truth had passed through him. Grace's letter painted memories Thomas had long buried under layers of resignation. The first time they met, the smell of orange peels on her fingers, the half-laugh she had when she was nervous. The night they stayed up talking in the library, her voice hushed but full of wonder. She had been sunlight in a house built on shadows, the kind of warmth that made you forget how cold it had been before her. In her letter, she spoke of their secret dreams, of moving away, building something of their own far from Kadara's watchful eyes. But then the tone changed, and the words grew jagged. "She found out," the letter read. "Amara found out, and everything changed." Grace had feared her sister's anger, but she hadn't expected the sharp edge of betrayal that followed. Amara had confronted her late one evening, alone, behind the family's orchard. The confrontation wasn't violent, but it bled with venom. Words were exchanged, accusations thrown like knives. "She said you were never mine to love," Grace wrote. "She said she wouldn't let me ruin the family. The last paragraph of the letter was smudged with water damage, or maybe it was tears, but enough remained to carry its final warning. If anything happens to me, Thomas, know that I didn't leave you. I was taken from you. I just don't know how yet. But if you're reading this, please remember me. Amara folded the letter and set it gently on the table. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath. Thomas leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, his eyes distant. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside him had begun to fracture. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, like it had clawed its way up from somewhere deep. "Where did you find that?" he asked, not with suspicion, but with something sadder, disbelief. Amara glanced out the window, where the rain had grown bolder, tracing long rivulets down the pane like veins on pale skin. 3 weeks ago, she said quietly. I was going through my father's things after he passed. The study was locked. No one had been in there for years. Hidden in a drawer beneath old legal files was a box, wooden carved, something he must have valued. That letter was inside, along with 4 others. Thomas blinked slowly, feeling like someone watching his own life from outside a glass wall. She wrote more, he asked. Amara nodded. Each one is dated, spaced out by days. It's like she was documenting her fear, preparing for something. Her words drifted off, her gaze far away, as if she could still hear Grace's voice in those crumpled pages. I don't know why my father kept them. Maybe he was trying to protect her, or me. Maybe he was ashamed. She didn't flinch when she said it. Shame, after all, had already passed through her like a storm. You were going to let me divorce you, Thomas said, his tone unreadable. Even after finding these? Amara met his gaze now, steady as a stone. I was. But then I found the last letter. The one where she remembered everything. And then, I found her. Thomas felt something shift beneath him. Not the floor, but the fragile structure of the truth he had built to survive. You found her? He asked, each word falling like broken glass between them. Amara nodded once, slowly. She's alive. She's not far. And she remembers everything. The room felt colder now, though the windows remained shut. Thomas pressed his palms together, the skin along his knuckles white from tension. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind, each one colliding into the next. Questions, doubts, images from a past he'd long tried to forget. He imagined Grace with her hair falling across her face as she read by candlelight, the sound of her laughter tucked into the folds of summer evenings, the letters she wrote trembling with the weight of a future denied. The idea that she had been alive all these years, breathing somewhere beneath the same sky, sent a pang through him so sharp he nearly doubled over. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice ragged. Amara didn't answer right away. She picked up the letter again, held it for a moment, then offered it back to him. Because it was never mine to keep, she said. And because the truth, whatever it does to us now, still belongs to you and her. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway, loud and deliberate, like it too had been waiting for this moment. Thomas took the letter from her hand, his fingers brushing hers briefly, once warm and familiar, now cold and distant. As he held the letter, the paper so thin it might tear under a heavy breath, something inside him hardened. Not into anger, not yet, but into a resolve he hadn't felt in years. If Grace was alive, and if what Amara said was true, then the man who had walked into this registry to end a chapter had, instead, just opened the door to a truth much older and far more painful than he had ever imagined. Thomas left the registry building with the letter still gripped in his hand, like a lifeline he hadn't yet decided to trust. The rain had softened into a mist that hung around the street like a memory, clinging to leaves, rooftops, and the collars of passers-by. He didn't walk immediately. For several minutes, he simply stood under the narrow stone awning, watching the water collect in little streams along the sidewalk, gathering in quiet puddles that reflected a world upside down. His thoughts were a chaos he couldn't sort, faces, moments, sounds, the scent of lavender in Grace's hair, the crunch of gravel the night she vanished, and now, the sound of Amara's voice saying those words. She's alive. There was something obscene about it, something both miraculous and cruel. How could a truth like that lie buried for so long, growing colder with each passing year, until now, suddenly, someone decided to exhume it? His hand trembled slightly as he looked down at the letter again. The ink was faded but intact, each word a scar traced in paper. The rain had spared it. The timing was cruel in its precision, too sharp, too exact to be mere coincidence. He tried to remember the exact night Grace disappeared, but the memories refused to come in order. They jumbled, overlapping like voices in a crowd, each one louder than the last. The only thing he was certain of was how it felt. It had felt like being left behind in the middle of a sentence. Like the page had been torn from the book and no one would admit they'd held the edge of it. He walked, finally, not toward his car, but in the opposite direction, down the street toward the older part of town where the houses leaned into each other like aging men sharing secrets. The streets here were quieter, the air denser, and the buildings older than the registry by at least half a century. The library where Grace once worked stood with its shutters closed, the paint peeling from its doorway like curled paper. A cat slinked past him, wet and uninterested, disappearing into a hedgerow as if it, too, had secrets to keep. He stopped at the iron fence surrounding the town's garden square, a place Grace loved. She used to sit on the third bench near the fountain, always with a book in hand and something thoughtful pulling at her lips. He remembered the way she would hum when she read, not loudly, just a thread of a tune, like a child speaking to herself in a dream. That bench was still there. It looked smaller now, or maybe the years had just made everything feel too distant to touch. He stepped inside the garden and sat down, placing the letter on his lap, staring at it like it might burst into flame and offer answers in smoke. Grace had written about fear, about Amara's threats, about a family falling apart in whispers and sideways glances. But she hadn't predicted this, being alive, being found, being remembered. That final letter was dated exactly 3 days before she disappeared. It wasn't a farewell. It was a record, a breadcrumb she must have hoped someone would find, even if it took years. That someone was now him. The bench creaked beneath his weight, its wood swollen with moisture, and he rested his elbows on his knees, head bowed, listening to the hush of rain and wind threading itself through branches overhead. If Grace was alive, she hadn't just been forgotten, she had been erased. The question that haunted him now wasn't only how Amara found her. It was why she had kept it hidden for so long, and what had finally made her tell the truth. By the time Thomas returned to his car, the clouds had thinned, and streaks of weak afternoon light poked through in patches, lighting up the windshield in fractured patterns. He slid into the driver's seat slowly, his body aching like he'd aged decades in a day. The car smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, the silence inside heavier than before. He sat there for a long while, staring at the steering wheel, listening to the occasional drip of water sliding off the roof. Then, with careful fingers, he pulled out the other letters Amara had given him. Each envelope bore Grace's handwriting. For in total, all written days apart, dated like a countdown. He read them one after another, slowly, his heart growing heavier with every page. Grace had been scared, not of strangers, but of her own blood. There were lines that trembled with hesitation, passages scratched out and rewritten, as though she wasn't just afraid of being found, but afraid of saying too much. There was no direct accusation, but something simmered between the words, something too bitter to be coincidence. Grace had feared Amara. She had loved her once, sisterly, protectively, but something had shifted in those final weeks, and it was in that shift that everything collapsed. Thomas leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered the last time he had seen Grace, the way she looked over her shoulder when she left the school grounds, her mouth parted as if she wanted to say something but changed her mind. That moment had replayed in his mind for years. Now it returned again, sharper than ever, and he understood what she hadn't said. She had wanted him to follow her. The next morning broke without ceremony. There was no dramatic sunrise, no trumpet of wind. Just the grayness of early light brushing against his bedroom wall. Thomas hadn't slept. He had spent the night sitting at his kitchen table, the letters spread out in front of him like fragments of a map he was supposed to navigate with no compass. His coffee had long gone cold. The air was thick with a silence that felt less like peace and more like waiting. He had made his decision before the sun came up. If Grace was alive, he had to see her, not because he didn't believe Amara, but because his heart needed proof that wouldn't vanish the moment he turned away. He called Amara at precisely 7:03 a.m. She answered on the third ring, her voice scratchy but alert, as if she'd been expecting the call. "Tell me where," he said. No hello. No preamble. There was a pause, but only a short one. Then she said, "Wendell Creek. She's staying there under the name Ella. She runs a flower shop 2 streets from the main post office. Its small, white front, green door." He didn't ask how she knew. The weight of those questions could wait. He packed a small bag, changed into a clean shirt, and stood in front of the mirror longer than he meant to. The man staring back was someone he barely recognized. Older, yes, but it was more than that. He looked haunted. Not in the way of someone who'd seen ghosts, but in the way of someone who had been one. At 8:14, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed, and he pulled away from the curb with a calmness he didn't understand. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from something. He was moving toward it. The drive to Wendell Creek was long but not unfamiliar. Thomas had passed through the town once, years ago, when the car had broken down during a road trip he and Amara took before the weight of their marriage began to sink. The roads then had seemed curious, almost inviting, like a place that promised secrets instead of hiding them. Now the air felt heavier, like it knew he was coming with questions no one wanted to answer. The journey wound through narrow lanes edged by trees that bowed like old mourners, their branches soaked from the previous day's rain, dripping onto the roadside like time wasting itself. As he drove, the sky hung low, thick with unspoken things. Each mile felt less like travel, and more like peeling back a curtain that had been left untouched for too long. His fingers gripped the steering wheel not from fear, but from something harder to name, a quiet anticipation lodged in his chest, both hopeful and hollow. At one point he pulled over, not because the car demanded it, but because his heart did. He stepped out into the chill and stared at the sky, uncertain whether it was courage or desperation that had carried him this far. The wind was soft, the kind that didn't push but whispered. He could almost hear her name in it, Grace. It felt surreal, like he was approaching a ghost who had asked to be remembered. And yet, everything in him believed that she was there. Not as she had been, but as she had become. The road didn't end. It only bent, guiding him forward into the kind of silence that felt like an inhale waiting for release. When he arrived at Wendell Creek, the town was exactly what Amara had described. Small, neat, built like a pocket folded carefully into the corner of the world. There was a stillness to it that didn't feel empty, only careful, as though its people knew how to guard what little peace they had. Thomas parked near the post office, a cream-colored building with ivy curling around its mailbox. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional sound of a bell from a nearby bakery and the soft shuffling of shopkeepers beginning their day. He stood beside his car for a moment, scanning the row of storefronts until he saw it, a small flower shop tucked between a bookstore and a bicycle repair shed. Its door was painted green, slightly chipped at the corners, and the window displayed a modest array of tulips, wild daisies, and lavender arranged with no fuss, no flourish, just quiet care. There was a name painted on the glass, Ella's Garden. The simplicity of it made his chest tighten. Ella, a name chosen to hide behind, or perhaps to live inside. He walked slowly toward the shop, each step echoing in his ears. The air smelled faintly of earth and something floral, something that reminded him of the mornings Grace used to press wildflowers into the pages of her journal, insisting they held memories better than words. As he reached the door, he paused, not out of hesitation, but because he realized this wasn't a reunion. It was something else, something gentler. He wasn't here to reclaim the past. He was here to witness what it had turned into. And somehow, he already knew that nothing would go back to the way it was. Inside, the flower shop was small but warm, lit not by fluorescent harshness but by golden bulbs that hummed softly like bees. The space smelled of soil and petals, and beneath it all, a trace of something sweet, perhaps honey or rose water. He took one slow step in, letting the door close gently behind him. The sound of a broom moving across the wooden floor reached him first, rhythmic and light. Then he saw her. Her back was turned, a braid tucked under a soft scarf, her frame wrapped in a thick cardigan the color of old pine bark. She was sweeping near a row of hanging ferns, unaware of the presence behind her. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Not because she looked the same, she didn't, but because she moved the same. That familiar ease, the calm grace in her hands, the quiet way she stood when she was thinking. His voice failed him, caught somewhere between now and then. He waited, heart pounding, unsure whether to speak or retreat. But fate, in its own odd rhythm, decided for him. A small ceramic pot near the windowsill slipped, knocking over a stack of postcards, and she turned at the sound. Their eyes met, and in that exact second, the world fell completely silent. She stared at him, broom paused mid-sweep, her face blank for only a heartbeat before something flickered. Recognition, slow and cautious, rising like dawn. He didn't smile. Neither did she. They simply looked, as if trying to find each other through the years that had built walls between their names. Her name now was Ella, and it rolled awkwardly off his tongue when he finally found the courage to speak. She didn't correct him. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him with the kind of steps that held both distance and memory. There were no dramatic embraces, no outcries or tears. Just two people who once shared something irreparable, now standing in the presence of what it had turned into. Her voice, when it came, was softer than he remembered, like someone who had learned to live among quiet things. I wondered how long it would take, she said, and he wasn't sure whether she meant his visit or the truth finding its way back. He tried to say her real name, but it caught in his throat. She shook her head gently. "It's all right," she whispered. "I still answer to both." They sat down eventually, 2 chairs near the front, separated by a small table where a pot of orchids bloomed. The conversation didn't come easily at first. Words moved like stones, carefully placed. He told her he had read the letters, that Amara had come forward. She listened, nodding slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. When she spoke of the accident, it wasn't dramatic. She said she remembered running, then headlights, then waking up with her name gone and a stranger's life being built around her. The couple who took her and never questioned where she came from, only who she was willing to become. It was peace for a while. But eventually the memories returned, not like a wave, but like a drip day by day. She said the hardest part wasn't remembering him. It was remembering who she used to be with him. That version of herself felt like someone else's story. And now, they were 2 people carrying a book they never finished, unsure whether to open it or leave it closed. The hours passed with the unspoken agreement that time had to be respected, not rushed. The clock on the far wall of the shop ticked softly, barely audible beneath the rustle of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Grace, though she had not corrected him when he called her by her old name, moved with a kind of careful composure, like someone learning to be alive in a space that had once belonged to someone else. They spoke in pieces, not full conversations, and in those silences between words, there was more understanding than 1,000 apologies could have offered. She told him that her life in Wendell Creek had not been glamorous or particularly fulfilling, but it had been quiet, and sometimes quiet is the closest thing to healing that a broken soul can afford. She had moments of memory that returned at odd hours, sunlight across a countertop, the feel of chalk dust on her fingers, a song he once hummed under his breath while marking papers. These flashes had come without pattern, without mercy, always leaving her breathless and aching in places she didn't know names for. When Amara showed up 6 weeks ago, Grace had expected fury, not tears. But her sister had arrived fragile and pale, holding the letters like they were evidence of a crime no one had ever punished. Grace had listened, said little, and when Amara asked for forgiveness, she had not answered. Not out of cruelty, but because some wounds needed more than a word to close. Now, sitting across from Thomas, watching him navigate his own grief and guilt, she understood something she had never seen clearly before. They had all lost different things in the same fire, and none of them had ever truly returned. Thomas did not ask her to come back with him, not even once. He knew the shape of that question, and he knew how heavy it would fall between them. Instead, he asked about her days, what flowers grew best in this region, whether she still wrote poems, if she had ever taken up painting again like she once dreamed of in passing. These questions had no hidden barbs, no ulterior motives. They were soft inquiries into the current of her life, and in answering them, Grace began to soften too. She spoke about the little boy who came in every Thursday with his grandmother, and always asked for violets because they reminded him of his late mother. She described the woman from the bookstore next door, who had taught her to bake cinnamon bread without a recipe. These were not extraordinary tales, but they were hers, and she clutched them gently as she told them, like someone sharing pages from a journal not meant for anyone else. There was comfort in this, a kind of reconciliation that didn't need grand statements or cinematic closure. It was enough to be seen again, without explanation, without judgment. At one point, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It wasn't a gesture of romance or regret, it was gratitude. For coming. For listening. For not demanding answers she had long since stopped having. The touch lasted only a moment, but in that moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement that while the love they had once known had not survived the storm intact, the memory of it had not been wasted. They walked together to the edge of the town just before dusk, past the fields that bordered the creek from which Wendell drew its name. The water moved lazily, reflecting the pastel shades of a sky preparing to sleep. There were benches scattered along the footpath, and they stopped at one that overlooked the bend where the current narrowed. It was quiet here, quieter than the town itself, as though this part of the world had learned to breathe without making a sound. Grace sat first, and he followed, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at her profile and wondered how many versions of her he had imagined over the years. Had he ever gotten close to the truth? She turned her face toward him then, catching his gaze with a soft, tired smile. I don't think I ever stopped loving you, she said, her voice barely louder than the rustling reeds. But I stopped waiting to be found. The words didn't sting. They settled. He nodded slowly. I never stopped hoping you were out there, he replied. But I stopped believing I deserved to see you again. Neither of them spoke after that for a while. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of river moss and wild mint. In that stillness, they shared something deeper than apology, something older than loss. A kind of peace that only comes from facing the storm and surviving it, not without damage, but with enough strength left to sit and remember how the rain once felt on your skin. The sun dipped behind the hills eventually, drawing the sky into a deeper shade of blue, the first stars slipping through like whispered prayers. Thomas walked her back to the shop, and this time they said less, because the goodbye had already begun. At the door, she turned to face him fully, both hands tucked into her sweater, her eyes reflecting the warm lamplight from inside. You don't need to come back, she said gently. But if you ever do, you'll know where to find me. He nodded, unable to form a reply that wouldn't betray the heaviness in his throat. And Amara? She asked. Her name lingered in the air like smoke, neither forgiving nor condemning. She's trying, he answered truthfully. For the first time, I think she's finally trying. Grace didn't respond to that. She simply nodded and reached out to straighten the collar of his coat like she used to, years ago, in a different life. Then she opened the door and disappeared into the warm glow of her shop. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, before turning and walking slowly back to his car. The night air had cooled. A soft mist hovered over the streets again, just like the morning he left Kadara. But this time he didn't feel lost. He wasn't walking away from something broken. He was leaving something whole, something that didn't need fixing to be real. As he started the engine and pulled away from Wendell Creek, he didn't look in the rearview mirror. Some chapters, once closed, don't ask to be reopened. They just ask to be remembered. And some love stories, even unfinished, still know how to end quietly with grace. Sometimes the truth arrives late, not to hurt us, but to heal what silence couldn't. In life, you may be forgotten, misunderstood, or even replaced, but never lose yourself in someone else's absence. Love should never cost your peace, and closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it begins the moment you choose to live without needing every answer. Keep your heart soft, your spirit open, and always know, even broken chapters can lead to beautiful endings. May your days never be darkened by secrets meant to harm you. May every truth hidden in the shadows find its way gently to your light. May the wounds of betrayal be replaced with peace, and may your heart never again be a prisoner of someone else's silence. May love return to you in its truest form, honest, healing, and whole. May God rewrite your story where it was torn, restore what was stolen, and give you joy that won't ask permission to stay. May the doors that closed against you never define your worth. May your journey ahead be filled with clarity, courage, and calm waters. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.